Hello everyone, today a bit of Reichsgeschichte, talking about the rise and murder actually of Philip of Swabia between 1198 and 1208 and the rise of Otto IV of Brunswick. Right, that we will discuss roughly up to 1211, 1212. This is a period we actually made already a couple of videos, this passage, especially the minor age of Frederick II, talking a bit about the international implications of it, and it's kind of one of the most important passages, let's say, in medieval history, one of the most important hubs, let's say. And today we begin, for the first time on Schwerpunkt, a bit more in-depth history, right? And I'm not sure whether we will completely abandon the previous manuals in the, let's say, comprehensive, generic, even if you want, perspective. Now we start digging a bit deeper, and especially trying to cover more homogeneously also the various parts of Europe, saying this just for the sake of the channel and those followers that have followed me for, now enough time to realize this is going to be hopefully better content than before. So we're talking naturally from the death of Emperor Henry VI onwards, which occurred in Messina, Sicily, on September 28, 1197. Right, and this was definitely a big blow for the destiny of the German monarchy, because fundamentally the Hohenstaufen had worked pretty damn hard to put together the empire, especially after the shrinking that naturally occurred given the international situation after the defeat of Legnano in 1176 against the Lombard League. And the most notable achievement after that had been the marriage of Henry VI, son of Frederick I of Hohenstaufen, with the last Siculo-Norman heiress, Constance of Hauteville. So that basically the Hohenstaufen had put together Swabia and namely, dynastically, the Sicilian inheritance. Today we will not discuss the connection between, of course they were trying to conceive the Kingdom of Sicily as potentially part of the empire. It's interesting also to see how Henry believed something, Constance something else, but they were doing it fundamentally for the sake of institutional, principle in a sense, but it still, went along fairly well. Constance was ahead in her age. She bore her child Frederick as the wanted, of course, heir of the Hohenstaufen. At that point, Henry VI died young, right? And at the moment in which the Hohenstaufen were actually pretty powerful, and we have recounted many times, this was a moment in which the Swabians could achieve literally the reunification of the Roman Empire. They went a step close to conquer Constantinople and to create something that, in the universalistic perspective of the empire, was definitely what all these powers were seeking. So you can imagine the death of Henry VI and the minor age of future Frederick II, what would have led to. And today we analyze this passage, essentially the negotiations that eventually followed with, for the election of the next German sovereign, eventually also king of the Romans and hopefully emperor, Holy Roman Emperor. As far as the competition between Philip of Swabia, who was Henry's brother, was one of the three sons of Frederick I, and Otto IV. Then instead was, as you know, the head of the Guelphs party, opposed to the Hohenstaufen in Germany. So these houses represented famously enough, the two major parties that eventually acquired not just a German national meaning, but also something broader. Think about the struggles in Italy between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Guelphs would have been the Italianization of Guelph, Ghibellines, the one of Weiblingen. It was the originary castle and also war cry of the Hohenstaufen, or Staufer, as actually were called at the time. At the time of his father's death, Frederick was 3 years old, the future Frederick II. And he had actually already been elected King of Germany, right? He was actually on his way to be crowned in Aachen, where you know that traditionally it wasn't like the single city where this could occur, as we'll see now also during negotiations. Not the kings of Germany, in fact, were elected somewhere like usually Frankfurt or Mainz, etc. Sometimes also Aachen itself, but Aachen was the place as the symbolical. It was not much of an important city like the others, but symbologically speaking, it was the capital that Charlemagne had founded. So, as the true founder of the empire, the city, the city bore this legacy of his, and in here, the would-be Holy Roman Emperors were elected as King of the Romans. That were let's say this extra step in between, the German kingship that technically was not more important, actually was less important, for example, than the Italic one, because the Italic one was, together with the title of Kings of the Romans, the only one that could make the King of the Romans access the Holy Roman Imperial title, because to that was attached, the defense of the papacy and everything. So actually, just the German kingship was something technically just local. That naturally meant a lot, because in order to be elected by the German princes, it meant that you had enough power to eventually pursue the universalistic, the imperial ambitions proper. At this time, instead, at the death of his father, Frederick was taken to Sicily, right? That we didn't say it, but it was actually a papal fief. That's also the problem. What actually the papacy, the Siculo-Normans, the Germans saw the kingdom like. As you know, Frederick would grow up fundamentally in Palermo, and that's the land to which he was fundamentally more attached, together with Apulia and so on. Even though he felt very, very highly for his not just imperial but also properly German royal authority when he was in Germany. He was a man of multiple background, let's say, and just look at his parents and think about the pride and the legacy of that. But we will not talk about him now. He's gone there because he basically became a pawn in the Italian struggles of Pope Innocent III, that also took him under his properly, literally, fatherhood. Right? Frederick was adoptive son of Pope Innocent III. The time of Innocent III, the papacy reaches the greatest power ever in the history of papacy. Most European, basically almost all of Catholic Europe is under, Roman Catholic Europe is under the papal, it's a papal fief, namely. And this crisis, this German crisis, brings naturally Innocent to intervene also heavily in these matters that were more importantly connected more than any other kingdom in the matters of naturally the struggle between papacy, empire, prerogatives, and so on. So the problem in here is that Frederick's succession was thought to be okay by the Germans, generally speaking. As you know, there was no properly dynastic succession in here, if not in the households, in the private territories of these princes, but the political balance was fundamentally in favor of the Swabians still. At the same time, however, this crisis opened a new opportunity for the Guelph dynasty to counter the Hohenstaufen's power. The thing was possible because at the end of the day, both the Swabians and the Guelph had a similar power in Germany. They covered mostly, the political geography of this is fundamentally complicated, as you know, especially in Germany, probably more than any other country in Western Europe at this point. But their centers of power more or less corresponded to certain defined areas, right? And this balance contributed naturally to lengthen the struggle over time and to fuel further further instability and possibility, in fact, of playing for the German princes, ecclesiastical, secular alike, to play with the balance, carve some power on their own. The Hohenstaufen, famously enough, had fundamentally at disposal their Duchy of Swabia, and also widely dispersed crown lands that, in that sense, they had put their hands on as the former emperors, with Henry VI, with Frederick Barbarossa. Also, they had, in this sense, from their side, the imperial ministeriales that were the essentially were starting to constitute at this point a really bulky part of the whole German knighthood. Right? They were servile. They were serf knights. It is a characteristic of the German ministeriales that, especially in the south of Germany, were really numerous. Right, and here in the south, Swabia, of course, was also involved in the regard, and the Swabians enjoyed the backing of, as we've seen, the majority of German princes and prelates together, at least as the majority of the force. Historically, their position in southern Germany and controlling the Alpine passes had, opened their way to Italy to pursue the Mediterranean policy. So that's also an important asset from a strategical point of view altogether. The Welfen, though, were backed, at least. They traditionally were located in Saxony, in Bavaria. Here, things had changed importantly, as we will see, also because of the intervention of the same Hohenstaufen. Think about the events with Henry the Lion. We'll see in detail on another occasion. But substantially, the Hohenstaufen had gotten the upper hand. However, the Welfen were supported by the northwest and the lower Rhine regions that were, by that time, definitely the most politically and economically developed German lands. Right? These were historically some also the most Romanized, the ones opened to the North Sea traffics, especially as we will see now with the contact with England. Cologne was also the most important archbishopric, right, and city in the empire, right? Cologne, they eventually would be institutionalized but already at this point, the fact it's like that, together with Trier and Mainz as the three main elector princes. It represented fundamentally Italy in the picture of the empire, right? Trier represented France, Mainz, Germany. Ideally, these were fully naturally German lands, but they were deeply involved in international politics and ecclesiastical politics. And the main connection with Cologne was England, as we remember. That was also dynastically tied to the Welfen. The same Otto of Brunswick actually was an Anglo-speaker. He had been raised in England. He had, he was a favorite of Richard Leonard, right? And the Archbishopric of Cologne was at that point held by Adolf of Altena, right? That had been an old opponent of Henry VI of Hohenstaufen, and he had at that point a coalition of princes and nobles from his Westphalian duchy, was fundamentally still was controlled also privately by him, and also the Lower Rhine. And naturally, at the death of Henry, Adolf was seeking, a policy of expansion to consolidate his domains. Right, and this is important because at the time of Frederick Barbarossa, the empire had tried fundamentally to strip Cologne from its role of major elector, right, and therefore there was a traditional enmity with the Swabians, right. Also consider that, yes, that's essentially where the Swabians were heading their aims, right, not just because they would be projected, at least as far as the German policy was concerned, not to crush the Welfen in Saxony, as they almost got close to it, but that's also a bit of a myth. They didn't really want to get rid of them. In a sense, they were also playing in favor when they stripped Henry the Lion of all his goods, all his fiefs, and exiled him but eventually they gave him back his allodial lands. This is what also allowed the Guelphs to survive, but there was not much of another option, right? They were just trying to please more than making a personal vendetta. Sometimes it's seen they would essentially just please this northwestern German principalities, mostly the ecclesiastical ones, were complaining of the territorial expansion of Saxony at the time, and also naturally, given that Swabians in the southwest, colonies north west along the Rhine, so as we've seen, that's where the most of German wealth was concentrated, or at least it was the richest German land, and the Swabians would naturally extend they sought to extend their control towards the north as far as the German policy was concerned, given that the Italian one always had the precedence in that regard. Something that these lands in insight didn't like at all, because naturally they were rich. They were a bit like the problem the Swabians had with the Italians, right? These were rich communities. The Swabians wanted to control their land, and all these lands were escaping the imperial policy. That's why we call, the Welf in that part of Germany and the Guelphs, as ideally the opponents of the imperials in Italy, because fundamentally across the Holy Roman Empire, these were kind of the most developed communities that were trying to simply escape from the centralizing pressure that the Swabians were exercising, right, for obvious reasons, which entailed naturally a Statal, the attempt of creating, like in England and in France, a German national monarchy, right, in the empire. And this didn't mean that the opponents were maybe not wanting to do the same, and we'll see it especially with the figure of Otto IV, that is being reevaluated in this sense, because traditionally it's been seen like a bit the villain, right, and the great defeated, as eventually he was indeed. But, as far as his intentions were concerned, there is a very interesting policy of secularization, of centralizing, and actually, as far as the Italian policy was concerned, actually he was just following the Hohenstaufen one, right? So that is to always bear in mind that these guys opposed, namely, not even namely, but practically the fact that the imperial authority, just because they wanted to become the next imperial authority. So it was just a big game of bullying, right? As far as they have a bitter struggle. Whoever emerged would try to do eventually the same thing, because that's fundamentally an intelligent thing to do. You do want to create a state, right? Whereas with all the anachronism, at least of the word, at least in the modernistic sense, all it. But technically, very important things at this point were happening, were about to happen, also because of the end of the struggle between the Swabians and Otto IV, at least in France, right, in the same Sicily that was well put at that point. And also the English influences here were quite important, because the German princes were much freer than the Norman barons in England, and this centralizing attempts also from the side of the Welfen were a pretty precise direction in that sense, as a model, as a pattern from England, that also was paying a freaking lot of money to support the Welfen in Germany, that point, for all the interested and nexted. And this had also to do, of course, with the struggle between France and England, because tendentially France was allied with the Swabians, right? Especially in the moment of crisis, because they knew that we're fundamentally searching trying to control Italy. It's not that France wouldn't do, but eventually, but they would actually succeed there in stripping actually the Hohenstaufen from the same Sicilian inheritance. But at this point, the English were still the Plantagenets were prepotently in France, and the Swabians were thinking about their own thing, and those who actually threatened France were the Welfen, who were struggling to create actually a properly more German thing, right? Not a universal empire based on Palermo or on Rome. That was the great universalistic dream, in which Germany would have been just a peripheral province, but properly creating something in the center of Germany, and also backed by England, that would have put France like in a press fundamentally. And that's what would happen also, as far as think about Bouvines and all the campaigns of John of England and Otto IV in that sense. We'll see this all in another video. So Adolf of Altena, Archbishop of Cologne, was now seeking his own candidate as being the head of this, anti-Hohenstaufen coalition at this point. He was naturally well inclined, but as we'll see, there were mixed interests towards the Welfen. That at least were the ones who could actively, that had this important international connections. They were traditionally the opponents of the Swabians, but also had been significantly crippled in the previous generations. In fact, Adolf's candidates were initially the Duke. They were not the Welfen, right? They were Bernard VI of Saxony, and eventually Berthold V of Zähringen. That essentially were also fundamentally the latter was a Swabian power, across today's Switzerland, Germany, also parts of France. If I remember correctly, next door to the Swabians, and opponents at this point. However, these princes were too poor for the expenses that were expected from them, because naturally, in order to propose themselves as the next kings, they had to pay a lot of people, to bribe a lot of people, and it turned out there were these costs were too much for them, right? And here is the Welfen connection, because actually Adolf of Cologne interests had greatly profited from Henry the Lion's downfall back in 1180, right? So it's not that he had a dramatic interest to back there a Saxon power that they had all struggled fundamentally to get rid of back in the day, but at the same time, the English connection was promising, right? And as we've seen, Cologne's merchants, to whom the Archbishop was heavily indebted, had great trade and finance interests towards England specifically. So there was definitely something in common these factions had. The candidate would be Otto, right? The future Otto IV was the third son of Duke Henry the Lion. As we said before, he was English by education, and also favorite of his own uncle, King Richard I himself. However, he didn't have much of a power base in Germany, because first of all, he owned just 1/3 of the, by the way, much diminished Welfen estates, right? He wasn't even the eldest son of Henry the Lion. However, Adolf worked to have him elected, casting the votes of his ecclesiastical colleagues of Mainz and Trier, and also by other important northwestern German prelates, so that on June the 9th, 1198, in Cologne, there was the election of Otto II, King of Germany. Eventually, Otto occupied Aachen with his own troops, and he was crowned by the Archbishop of Cologne in Charlemagne's church on July the 12th, 1198, with all this symbolical importance that this had. And this also tells you how private German policy was, right? That wasn't basically now very few of public authority left. This crisis actually, this is exactly after the death of Henry VI, in perspective at least, I couldn't say the non-going back point, but the moment in which German public authority was significantly crippled, and that even the same Frederick II, in spite of his ultimate political victory over Otto, would never be able to fully recover, so that he, at a certain point, as a German king, he just had to grant something to the princes in exchange for the recognition of his own authority, and beginning to behave literally as one of them, right? Trying just to seize dynastically, I don't know, Austria, for example, especially creating this solid, state, this territorial possessions in southern Germany to secure the Alpine passes. and all the trades connected more, not just because of strategical reason. And Otto's election also had to give something, was exchanged for the renounce of the Guelphs, for all the claims on the Duchy of Westphalia that, as we've seen, belonged to Adolf, and that was the insurance of saying, okay, yeah, well, we know what we're doing this for, but as far as the local policy is concerned, you don't have to touch my property. At that point, the Hohenstaufen faction came together, right, by during the Christmas 1197. An important figure in this was the Duke Bernard of Saxony, that, as we've seen, would have been backed by the same Adolf of Altena had the guy being too poor, right? So that the Welfen connection was not even a big deal for him. And in fact, the same Bernard had, as Duke of Saxony, had a legitimate fear that the Welfen, by regaining power, would have, like it had just happened with Otto's crowning, would recover much of their own patrimony and would kick him out of Saxony. So, from his side, Philip of Swabia was elected in March 1198 as King of Germany. So this is normal for anybody who knows German politics during the Middle Ages. Each faction, the college, to say at this point there was not the institutionalization of the 7 electors. Something would become much later, and was not even that sclerotic afterwards. At this time, technically, the princes of the empire literally meant everybody, right? Even knights, at least the free ones. So it was just the older idea of the public recognition, right? That, however, passed through, as you understand, through this very private means. So each faction, Germany was split. Each faction would elect their own candidate, right? There was no central authority that could say, okay, I decide who does it. It's the two factions that do it on their own turn. So Philip has himself elected King of Germany. Then he tries to enter Aachen, but he's not let in, right, by the enemy forces, and therefore he is crowned in September as King of the Romans in Mainz, other very important center, where there were such elections also connected. Even in here, there was nothing, let's say, categorical about even the place, as far as the people who participated would be the authoritative ones. In fact, Philip's election was fine as far the crown was concerned, but not much of the man that would deliver it to him, who was the Burgundian Archbishop of Tarentaise, that didn't have much of a this appeal among the Germans, at least from a symbolical point of view. So this shows you the picture of the mess also that this situation concretely was from a political point of view. Consider at this point that there were armies drawn by the two contendants that were also ravaging around. There wasn't much of an interest. There was a lot of negotiations going on still. So these armies made kind of timid moves, and they didn't impact more than much. But the threat of violence was there, and it definitely was enforced also at a local level, as we have seen with Aachen, for example. So what actually changed a bit the balance, definitely in favor of Philip, was the alliance between the Swabians and the Carpathians in 1199 that mirrored in that sense the Welfen Plantagenet one, right? And this was an important game changer, but at the same time was not decisive. And the last word at that point was, from an international point of view, for the most important figure in Europe at the time, the Pope, right? That traditionally, since the conquered date of Worms, had normally not had much of a say into the German affairs, because mostly they had split it had always had, of course, some of it, but tendentially the thing was split between Germany and Italy, as far also as the various elections, the elections of local bishops were concerned. They had split prerogatives. At this point of crisis, naturally, the papacy saw a very important opportunity, chance to intervene more directly in the German affairs. So, Innocent III, Pope Lothar from the Counts of Segni, pontiff between 1198 and 1216, had up to that point remained out of the context, right? And also he was just waiting and seeing, because naturally the matter could be settled in Germany itself on its own, but also at that point both contendants seemed to be pretty evenly matching, and they had communicated the election of their respective candidates to the papacy and starting bribing the Curia for obtaining the formal recognition of the election of their own candidate. There was a different attitude between the two partisans, because naturally the Welfen were simply asking respectfully the Pope for the confirmation of their choice. These were the representatives, as we said, mostly of local German interests, so they didn't have much to say against the papacy, if not, in the general, they would have not been particularly happy of a papal intervention in local affairs, but they hadn't taken like an international stand against the papacy. On the contrary, they had backed the papacy against the Swabian expansionism. On the contrary, Philip's supporters were harsher, warning the Pope against infringing the empire's prerogatives. They were simply continuing the Hohenstaufen policy in the matter with the papacy, because they counted on coming back in Italy with force, and this attitude probably also says from a diplomatical expression that probably the Swabian faction at that point was already stronger, and therefore more confident not just to flatter the papacy, but it's simply to say, be careful about, because yielding the authority is simply submitting to the papacy. Even the Swabian authority would have somewhat crippled also the Hohenstaufen credibility in front of the empire altogether. So that was something they definitely didn't want to do. There was also a minor faction that still tried to revive the candidacy of the young Frederick of Hohenstaufen, and this policy was promoted mostly from Conrad of Wittelsbach, that was the Archbishop of Mainz. It was involved, as we've seen, also with the general backing of the Swabians, but still, proposed this solution that apparently would have seemed, in terms of, civil of concord, a more Solomonic solution, but naturally the political reality was different. Also, Conrad died in those years, so nothing was to be done of this proposal. So, at the same time, Philip was naturally negotiating with the papacy. Still, things were going on just like that, and Innocent was actually asking for very heavy conditions for the recognition of his crown, which Philip rejected, right? And it was evident at that point the Swabians were stronger, so the papacy opted for the Welfen, also because he realized that had they gotten too weak, it was like an opportunity lost. It was simply meant to give too much strength to the Swabians. So he wanted to counterbalance the weaker by backing the weaker side. There was a problem, in fact, with the English at this point to financing the war in Germany. Right, they were having problems on their own. So the thing didn't look good for the Welfen at this point, and the Pope decided to use his authority to back them. Therefore, between 1200 and 1201, Innocent III proclaimed Otto king. Right, it was in fact solemnly re-elected, let's say in terms ceremonially speaking, in Cologne on July the 3rd, 1201. Otto, in turn, gave something to the church, which was basically renouncing to the rights over the German church, and also recognizing the papal claims in Italy. These two aspects were crucial, right? Because as far as the rights over the German church were concerned, basically this said that the papacy could, invest in its own expansion in the kingdom from a political point of view. And also the Italian matter was perhaps even more important, because here there was like a plurisecular problem with all those possessions that the papacy had always claimed to be their own, the empire their own. It concerned mostly the region of Romagna that eventually would have been acquired just at the time of Rudolf of Habsburg, that granted it in 1278, even in exchange for the recognition of his kingship of the Romans, and therefore this also reflects in its as demand something so big that naturally we can understand Otto agreed, because it was like the last resort, right? Namely saying, okay, I'll give you these rights, but given the volatility of the political situation, and as what Otto would actually do as in terms of imperial policy in Germany, in Italy, and towards the church, that he actually thought completely the other way around those dealings. These were agreed in Neuss on June the 8th, 1201. In exchange, the papacy also banned the Swabians at that point, but it didn't have much of a political impact in Germany itself. It was just a formal recognition. I mean, everybody knew what was going on, right? Nobody believed that they could achieve more than much, and the situation was definitely very, very complicated. Also, the Swabians lost important supporters. One was Otto IV, Przemysl, King of Bohemia, that received the recognition of his own kingship over Bohemia that had already been granted to him by Philip of Swabia, and also the Landgrave Hermann of Thuringia that had been bought multiple times, and was just cashing like that by switching side. So in Mainz, a Welfen partisan was installed as archbishop as well after Conrad. So this rebalanced a bit the situation, but it wasn't enough, and this can be seen, among other things, also by the recognition by Otto of the Danish conquest of Holstein, right, and including the very important towns of Lübeck and Hamburg, right? Lübeck had been founded by Henry the Lion. It was like a very important city for the wealth policy, the expansion in the Baltic. So such a recognition to the Danish reveals actually that Otto didn't fare too well, right? And in fact, still a majority of ecclesiastical and lay princes backed Philip, and 32 of them even sent a very bitter letter to Innocent III saying, what the hell are you doing, right? You're interfering in our electoral prerogatives. We do not want the papal legate tell us what to do. This was sent from Halle in January 1202. Innocent answered on that occasion with the papal bull Venerabilem, explaining what were the legal grounds for which the papacy could interfere in that regard. Is on March 26, 1202. And in spite of this formal recognition of Welfen power, the balance began to tilt in favor of the Hohenstaufen, right? And in fact, at this point, the English were feigning in France, and Philip of Swabia passed on the offensive, militarily speaking, against the Welfen. So we do not understand pretty much. I mean, we're talking about early 13th century Germany. It's not that we know everything about it, But we realized that you can imagine in Germany all the mess that was going on in the meanwhile at the local level. Like, local lords going wild, exploiting this mess to seize, to raid, to consider that there were the crown lands here, that in these moments were, some of the tastiest and juiciest lands that all these privates wanted to seize, also knowing that if they had managed to do that, whoever would have been elected later would have been significantly weaker, and therefore they would have had better chances to keep on doing whatever the heck they liked. So in spite of this, many German princes came over into the Hohenstaufen's camp. Even some of the most important Welfen players, right? Otto's own brother, Heinrich, that was Count Palatine of the Rhine, passed to the Swabians in spring 1204. Also, the Duke of Brabant. Consider that Otto was married to Maria of Brabant, so this polity definitely had a specific international meaning for him. Many counts from the same Lower Rhine and Westphalen passed to Philip. And even, because of the reasons, in part what we were saying before, the same Adolf of Cologne, the same Archbishop of Cologne, that was legitimately worried for his Westphalian duchy, given that Otto had reacquired certain power in the area, and also fearful of this inherent tension that existed between the bishop and the city of Cologne. As we've seen, was the largest in Germany, had this very important burgher community of merchants that were seeking to essentially emancipate themselves from the archbishopric authority, and the Otto would have probably played in that direction. We'll see it at the end. In fact, it was true, exploiting the Welfen protection, and also more pragmatically, because Adolf recognized, as any other prince, that it would have been naturally advantageous to side with the likely winner that at this point was seeming ever more Philip. So much, in fact, that the same Adolf came over him in November 1204. He was richly rewarded by the Hohenstaufen with money, privileges. This was all bought. All of these political choices were bought. There were constant negotiations, money flowing here and there. And therefore, also Philip had his own re-election, being crowned finally in Aachen on January the 6th, 1205. So the thing was done. This is how Philip of Swabia was elected, King of Germany, King of the Romans. Also the Thuringian Landgrave, the King of Bohemia, that as we've seen had abandoned the Swabians, now submitted newly to Philip, right? And there was also, at the very end, the capitulation of the city of Cologne herself, that, as we've seen, was one of the most, among the various players, one of the most prone to support the Welfen power, also because they had the money, right? And in fact, this passage happened because of the deal with the Münzer Hausgenossen, that was the patrician society of minters. And however, it happened at the very end, when Philip achieved actually a military victory on the battlefield against Otto at Wassenberg on July the 27th, 1206. Important battle. That's where Otto tried basically the last resort, the last card, right? And he was defeated. So this was very important to actually sanction the Swabian victory, because that was the point. Who was the authority there? Who had the sword, right? So having won was naturally a pretty good indicator from a political point of view of the power of the contendant. Also, Innocent III recognized Philip, and they began the negotiations. The papal ban was lifted from the Hohenstaufen, and also a one-year truce was established in the Kingdom of Germany. There was no publishing of the terms reached between the king and the pope, which were, however, achieved by spring 1208. But these seem to have included the marriage, or at least the promise of marriage between the Pope's nephew and Philip's daughter, the Hohenstaufen's imperial coronation, and the same renounce that already Otto had agreed of the royal rights over the German church on the side of Philip. After all this mess, all this negotiation, what happens actually for a trivial reason, or at least a previous reason that had not much to do with this game altogether, was the assassination of Philip by hand of Otto of Wittelsbach in Bamberg on June the 21st, 1208. This started from a private resentment. Otto was Count Palatine and of Bavaria, and the thing naturally threw Germany in new turmoil, and a new center of power had to be found. And at that point, actually, Otto was the only option left, telling the truth. And in fact, the German princes quickly agreed to back him. And there was also a composition of the struggles between the same Hohenstaufen and the Welfen, because consider that the system was pretty unstable, so nobody was really, at that point, after all these struggles, military campaigns, so happy to continue on. They needed to take a breath once again, so much that Philip's eldest daughter was married to Otto, who proclaimed himself absolutely firm in avenging the killing of Philip himself, which was an important political move, but objectively, the way that the assassination happened was definitely bad, right? And there was no mercy towards the killer, as we will see. Otto was re-elected as a formal sanction for a third and a fourth time, respectively, by the Saxons at Alberstadt, and also by an unusually large gathering of 55 princes at Frankfurt on November the 11th, 1208. Frankfurt had been also an important center for these occasions, for diets, for elections, and so on. And also, there was a general pacification issued by Otto, Landfriede, to further stabilize the situation in Germany. Otto of Wittelsbach punishment was carried out by the Hohenstaufen clienteles, as Heinrich of Calden was the leader of the Hohenstaufen Ministeriales, slayed him, avenging thus Philip's assassination. And after this, Otto IV, however, was not, he had consolidated now an important power, right? But at the same time, he had to negotiate his international role now, especially with the papacy. In fact, he renewed and amplified his promises to Innocent, but at the same time, he left an ambiguity in the picture, because he, in this agreement, didn't really commit the princes. So this of the empire, so that this was naturally understood, but both by the papacy and by the rest of the Germans as, that as a formality, as a sort of, just appeasement, a formal appeasement, but not really something substantial from a political point of view. Innocent III at this point agreed to crown Otto Holy Roman Emperor, which occurred in Rome on October the 4th, 1209, as it was normal, and in full legitimacy according to the rules. However, this Raumfahrt entailed the immediate, let's say, about turn of Otto IV's policy, right? Because as soon as he set foot in Italy and reckoned emperor, he began to perform the very same Hohenstaufen policy. He stayed with his army in the peninsula, he interfered with the Lombard and Tuscan affairs, and also he prepared a military expedition to Sicily to seize the kingdom. Consider that in all this picture, as also would happen with Frederick's rise to power, right, when he had to swear that the papacy would have not reunited institutionally the kingdoms of Germany and Sicily and Italy, as it technically belonged to him, but actually the center of power was Sicily at that point. Germany saw it as just the Swabian possessions. Italy, not so much, aside from the sympathies that he could rise among the Ghibellines. And because imagine the papal perspective in here, right? We often say that we look at the popes as the villains of the picture, but telling the truth, they were playing, first of all, very cleverly, but they had definitely their own reasons to fear pretty much from Germany and Sicily coalesced against Rome, plus the Italian support, and they were struggling to avoid that, because it's not that the Holy Roman Emperors were just passive. They were always engulfed in all these problems in Germany, in Italy, whatever. So it was somewhat easy for the popes to play against them, relatively easy. But the question is that whenever the Holy Roman Emperors gained power, the first thing they wanted to do was to exalterate the papal authority, secular matters, and fundamentally take over Rome and the papal election and the clergy and the city, and creating what would have been the dream of the reestablishment of the Roman Empire in the proper secular, in the plenitude of secular power, as it was like just by Byzantine imitation. And here are all the problems since the donation of Constantine and the struggle for ambassadors that we have seen many times. But specifically, these were real policies, right? It was not wishful thinking. That the balance could be shifted dramatically easily. At least it was dramatically unstable, and everything could change from a moment to another. So, as harsh as these policies were, they were definitely effective. In November 1210, Otto IV invaded Apulia, and basically by mid-1211 he controlled the greater part of southern Italy, right? Sicily was actually left aside. That's where also the young Frederick II, as we'll see in another video, was preparing a counteroffensive. He even landed in Calabria, and he risking to be wiped out, right? We will talk about the youth of Frederick there, where he demonstrated immediately his capabilities, his courage, his vision, right? But at this time he was weak, right? Otto had taken over, right, and it would take Bouvines to overturn the picture here. So it was as you understand, that would bring very much the Hohenstaufen close to the papacy at that point, so much that his the Hohenstaufen election would become unavoidable after the victory over Otto IV. Otto was clever in this campaign because he basically gathered consensus in Italy, and also recovering those German ministeriales that had been stranded in the peninsula after Henry VI's death, right? So imagine all these knights that basically had remained scattered in these lands that didn't know much else what to do, because Frederick was a minor. The local barons would immediately take over. There was these ministeriales that were formally there in the name of the Swabians, and that probably didn't fare pretty well. Otto IV had reinvaded these lands, so many of them, of course, passed to his side, because even if they didn't belong to his clientele, they had to make a living, and some of these people would be crucial also. They would take over. Think about Markwald of Amweiler, famously also for the control over Frederick II. I mean, these were scrupulous men they naturally wanted to carve their own power on their own, and all the game was like that for everybody involved. The fascinating fact in here is analyzing Otto IV's policy, right? As we were saying before, given the means at his disposal that weren't great, as we've seen, because he lacked a consistent amount of autonomous power on his own, especially considering his original lands, the properties that he actually controlled. So the Italian policy, specifically the Sicilian invasion, was obvious. This was one of the most advanced kingdoms in Europe, had still much of a hell of a political administrative system from Norman times going on. Frederick II would boost it in a centralized fashion further. In this land would be achieved some of basically the unique case in Western juridical tradition, in which the king could basically was not ruling just to respect the local community's laws, but actually legiferating to create a law on its own. This tells you how much the Sicilian kingdom was centralized. It might this time started to be detrimental, right, because of the lack of a concrete power in war, as you can imagine. But the Sicilian kingdom was even more centralized than one of England, right? And this means a freaking lot. And the interesting thing, though, is Otto's German policy, because, and that's where probably also lost much of the consensus that would bring to his final defeat, because, as we were hinting at before, his intention was to centralize, right? We often think about Kantarovic's work that looked at Frederick II as like the secular king that wanted to centralize everything. He took that a bit too far, but definitely that was a bit of his intention. Well, the German nationalistic historiography back in the 19th century stigmatized Otto IV, not just because he lost pretty badly on the field, but also because he had, in that sense, the burden, the responsibility in the romantic ideal of that context to embody, according to that old historiography, the Germanness of the empire. I mean, the fact that the Swabians were allegedly these dreamers lost in the chimera of the Mediterranean dreams that instead were pretty carried. It's exactly what Otto IV did in the same time. That's why he was accused by the nationalistic historiography, and that instead the true German thing was the expansion in the Baltic, in the east, from the German lands from the north, from Saxony, this core land of hard, tough Germanness. And think about the beautiful, by the way, weapon of the Welfen here, the dragon, right? This almost pagan symbol that, in fact, would also be highlighted in that way in the French sources after the victory of Bouvines, because the Philip II that had also made the mass before the battle as a sort of priest king, defeats the evil German with the pagan symbol. That's a bit the French side of the story, right? So Otto did embody, really, yes, we can say that German national monarchical interest that is being criticized against the Hohenstaufen, but it's a misunderstanding, right? The truth is that they were both seeking to do the same thing, right? And they did it through the same ways. The German policy, the Italian policy. And that was the only way to make it, right? Because they didn't have resources. And it is true that Germany was difficult to centralize, even worthless to centralize, where we could mount an expedition could take the whole Sicilian kingdom. It was much more centralized, better organized, already programmed to be a real kingdom, right? And you have Germany as a total mess of just a privatistic, minded princes who are, some of them you can't even dislodge from their own. Nobody ever conceived to unify the country, because it was impossible. Let's be honest about it. It's never been so. That Germany had now been stably an elected thing. The closest the Hohenstaufen went to make it a German national monarchy was in 1180. against Henry the Lion, but even in there they couldn't push the hand too further, right? So much that they had to give them back their allodial possessions, because otherwise that would have been like the greatest offense ever to the freedom of the princes altogether, through the example of Henry the Lion. And they didn't even want to do it, technically, at the beginning. Otto IV had, in this sense, an iron-fisted project that was the one of enforcing in Germany the same English model of rule, right? That is the one that before the battle of the defeat of Bouvines, and eventually, as you know, the Magna Carta and all the various constitutions in the 13th, at the end of the 13th century would be even more important actually than the Magna Carta itself. But the English monarchy was trying to control the barons pretty heavily. Hadn't Bouvines happened, we would know a completely different world today, because from the English institutional system stamped after Bouvines, we know all the great, actually, involvement of the barons in the royal policy and administration, and all a completely different political philosophy and vision, etc. But England was actually a pretty well unified and administered kingdom, and it served as a model for Otto, that, as we've seen, had been raised in there, so knew how the mechanism worked, and wished to enforce it in Germany itself. And not only, that's where probably he took it too far, because it's like if you want to try one of the two things, that together they're too much, but even one would be a big deal. Well, he had a general scheme to raise a general tax and plans for the secularization of ecclesiastical property, which also became public. It was discovered. This naturally rose an enormous concern. Of course, the papacy at that point began to freak out and to prepare its strike back, because it was inconceivable, right? What the hell? And we can't speculate. I don't know, honestly. There are works on this. There's Hacker 1990 that is an interesting read, but the intention is fascinating here. It was basically about literally centralizing and secularizing Germany as a centralized state. Further, possibly than other examples, even probably in practice, it would have never succeeded. Right, it would have not even gotten closer to the standard of certain other countries. But the intention here, the idea of starting that, and of exploiting, especially with which power? With English support, yes, but in Germany specifically, as we have seen, the money of the rich towns and cities of the Lower Rhine, right? That were the ones who were seeking to get rid of their overlordships, whether ecclesiastical. That's why Adolf of Altena didn't like the Belfast himself and just backed Otto for a while, because it was better than having the own stuff and knocking at their door. But that meant like in that mindset, like a revolution, like the idea you could knock out the Archbishop of Cologne to make all these merchants rise in Cologne. It's something beyond. It's something incredible, right? It's really too far, and this would naturally create a pretty big mess in Germany, and in a way possibly tells how more ill-fated than it seems actually Otto's perspectives and possibilities were to try so boldly to do something like that, right? It was not probably about him being too much. He probably spotted probably the riskiest solution, but the one that could give him more. And for this, he definitely deserves he credit. And this is, by the way, also a bit of this attitude, as we have seen it, was the same one for which he promised, I don't know, to the Danish, Lübeck and Hamburg, that is also like giving part of your home to some, to a foreigner at the end of the day. It was just the claim, right? It was just formally say, okay, well, we'll give you by now, right? But pretty much knowing that would have not been a long run thing. And yes, it might have been a clever policy, but it was definitely risky. And definitely were plenty of people that didn't like this at all, and think that this also intertwined with international situation was pretty much messed up. So we stop it here for today, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.